Hello, welcome. Glad to have you. All right, and so today we're going to do a single section argument. All right, and it's pretty straightforward, I believe. Okay, so far you guys have learned about the Native Americans, hopefully a little bit about, in particular, the Maya and the Aztec. Uh, and then we did the Spanish. I believe we've done the Spanish colonizer and the Black Legend. So let's see here. Get all your names down. So what we're doing today is demonstrating the extent to which, although it was a one-way street in many ways, with the Spanish in control of their Spanish colonies, that does not mean that those who, quote, lost, hence the Native Americans, were incapable of demonstrating agency and showing what they affecting history in their own way. All right. So we look here, and there's a term, right? Mestizaje. I love it because it's broader than its English equivalent. Okay, with the English, right? We usually use the term miscegenation when it comes to interethnic marriage and procreation, right? And having, quote, biracial kids, etc. That's the fancy word. And of course, with the black codes and the Jim Crow laws, miscegenation between black and white Americans in the South for quite some time was illegal. And then when it comes to just culture and not biology, not biologically mixing, but culturally mixing, they usually use the term syncretism. Okay. Syncretism implies that the borrowing of culture is a two-way street. Okay. But in Spanish, right, mestizaje or mixing refers to both. You have one word that refers to both biological miscegenation and cultural syncretism. Okay. And so what I'm simply saying is, and that's where they get the term, by the way, mestizo, right? When you have Native American and Spanish blood. All right. So getting into the origin of this, I try to concede that the Spanish clearly were in control, and the circumstances in which there was biological mestizaje, it sometimes, sadly, was the result of coercion or rape. All right. So I start off and I start contending how the Spanish had their own agenda. You could look at any of the early modern countries that colonized the Americas, and they're no different. Okay. Yes, there is a little bit of truth that the French did not bring forth the resources to have to exemplify a serious attempt to colonize the Americas. They're more into fur trapping and trade. The Dutch as well, with exceptions, right, of the northeastern part of Brazil and New York. The Dutch tried to colonize there. But at any rate, with the English especially, the English were here to settle, right, to populate the area, to create settlements and colonies. And the Spanish were no different. All right. So at any rate, when the Spanish come, we have, clear evidence of kind of hubris, right? Arrogance. King Charles V, he was also known as the Holy Roman Emperor. That goes all the way back to 800 in Charlemagne, right? And with Charlemagne, right, he was a Frank in France. His dad stopped the Muslims at Tours, and the Pope needed a strong ally. He was not getting along well with the eastern section of the old Roman Empire that Constantine had begun in Byzantium or Constantinople, over, by Turkey. And so at any rate, he was worried about the Byzantine Empire. He was worried about Islamic attacks. And it won't be long, he'll have the Danes, the Scandinavian Viking Danes, knocking on the door throughout Europe as well. So he crowned Charlemagne in this kind of a mythical new Roman Empire. And a lot of people joke that it wasn't holy, it wasn't Roman, and it wasn't much of an empire. But yet that entailed, right, Germany and the Scandinavian countries, France, Spain, okay? And so it was pretty impressive in its size, but it was always contested, okay? But at any rate, Charles V, who happened to be the Holy Roman Emperor, also took the throne as Charles I, or Carlos I, in Spain, okay? And he declared, right? He said, you have here, um, by virtue of Pope Alexander VI, who by coincidence happened to be a Spaniard himself, and other just and legitimate titles, we, Spain, or in particular Castile, which was the most powerful of the Spanish regions and kingdoms, are Lord of the West Indies. So we had no problem. The Spanish had no problem with claiming the West Indies, right? And of course, we went over the fact that there were kind of two phases, right? The semi joke is the conquistadores, the conquerors, conquered much of the Americas south of the U.S. border, and the royal Spanish crown had to conquer them, right? Because they were kind of upstarts. They were kind of, a fancy word is parvenu, like a nouveau riche, someone who had not been noble before, but fought his way into noble status and had a lot of ambition and so forth, right? And of course, Hernan Cortez is at the top of that list. They took a lot of his land away. They removed him back to Spain and made him stay there. So they were trying to tame their own conquerors. But when there was the conquest in that initial phase, right, we mentioned that as almost a win-win for the crown, because he said, hey, if you're willing to somehow get together your own money, your own capital, your own weapons and private armies, and you risk your own neck across the Atlantic and contending with these Native American confederacies, if you live and you conquer it, we will reward you with Hidalgo status. We'll let you have an encomienda, the forced labor of those beneath you, and and other privileges. Sometimes there was a political position as well, like an adelantado, which was kind of like a regional governor. All right, and so they rewarded him for such. And then, of course, they were able to put Castile and Spain's flag on that land. So the crown doesn't venture or risk anything. It's the private individuals, and the crown gets rewarded as well as the conqueror. So when that happened, there's no doubt that there was conflict, needless to say, right? So if you adhere to Las Casas' depiction of the conquest, he said his fellow Spaniards were filled with diabolical greed, right? They have lost all fear of God once they got here to the Americas. They butchered men and women and children, these, quote, meek sheep, Native Americans. They did some of it in order to simply make the Native Americans afraid of attacking them. And that was according to some of the Spanish sources themselves, all right? So at any rate, whether you adhere to that or you believe that there's any credibility in conquistador accounts like Castillo, Castillo says, come on, man, it was a lot shadier grade than that. On our way to the capital of Tenochtitlan, we were ambushed at least 3 times on order of Moctezuma II himself. This guy was very deceptive and very shrewd, he said. And when we walked into the capital, they whistled and hissed at us, the Aztec warriors. They threatened in their Nahuatl language that they were going to kill and sacrifice, kill and eat us, etc. And so he shows a much more complex picture than just awful Spaniards and victimized Native Americans. But regardless, right, of what narrative you tend to adhere to, there's plenty of conflict, needless to say. All right. So then I said, gingerly, from that context of fighting in the first phase, you have to address the issue of rape. Okay. And yes, you had cases of that. So according to a conquistador Castillo himself, he said Spaniards, as soon as they saw that they had won, that they were winning the Aztec capital against Cuauhtemoc, their last leader, they began going into the houses and other places and just grabbing Native women and taking them to themselves, to such an extent that Cuauhtemoc said, "Hey, wait a minute," to Cortez when he had been caught. He said, "Our women have all been taken. We want them back." All right. And so momentarily, Cortez does so, but then he, quote, grants Moctezuma II's daughter to his buddy, okay, for marriage or even just to be a concubine. And then also Columbus in the Caribbean before that, in the 1490s, quote, gave a Carib Native American woman to Michel de Cuneo, his buddy. And Cuneo's account is awful, absolutely awful. He not only forces himself upon her, but he brags about it. So then I say, right, that has been written about and spoken about by a lot of, you know, psychologists, etc. When you have power to give or withhold something greatly desired or needed by the victimized demographic, you could abuse your power. All right. However, what I say is, thank goodness, is that phase didn't last. So 1492, right? They're fighting in the Caribbean almost immediately against the Carib. And then they fought over gold against the Taino. And then they fought over the Fort Navidad massacre against their own ally, the Arawak. But within 10 years, in 1502, Nicolas de Ovando came as the new governor, and he put in that royal bureaucracy that we have covered on like number 5 of the Black Legend, right? Of how kind of inequitable and hierarchical Spanish America was. You had the viceroy on top, regional governors appointed, corregidores could go to the city councils and overturn what they passed and demand the repartimiento, so that the natives had to do public works for a certain segment of the year each year. It was very not egalitarian, people on equal footing. It was not democratic, but yet what was in the 1500s? But at any rate, so clearly it's a one-way relationship as far as power, pretty much the political realm as well as the economic realm. Because remember, in economics, the House of Trade back in Spain, as well as the Council of the Indies back in Spain, they decided on law, and they decided on who could trade in what commodities at what ports, right? So the big money makers, you had to be a well-connected Spaniard of noble status to be able to trade in slaves, sugar, cocoa, the big money makers. However, there's a third realm, right? We mentioned political and economic. What about the social realm of culture? And I'm contending that the Native Americans, despite losing in the other two categories, fared pretty well socially. They made their mark, so much so that Mexican Americans today can equally owe their heritage to Native Americans and not just the Spaniards. Okay, so syncretism did happen. You had private migration by pobladores, by settlers, and then also the ordinances of discovery by Philip II. He's the Spanish Armada king. In the 1580s, he issued the ordinances of discovery, and he said the time of military conquest is over. Anything we do now, as far as spreading our wings in the Americas, has to be done peacefully through the missionaries, and no more fighting, he said. All right, so that's all going to help into becoming a less coercive environment in Spanish America. So then I said, and this is kind of my main point, my main supportive area, is that syncretism happened in religion. All right. The Spanish, the Catholic Church, right? When the Reformation happened, Martin Luther, a guy named Zwingli, a guy named Calvin, these guys attacked a lot of the fundamental beliefs of their former Catholic Church, right? They challenged, the idea of authority. To them, right, especially Luther, they said only Scripture only, right? The Bible only is the only authoritative word that we are to follow. But with the Catholic Church, right, They believe that from that verse in the Gospel of Mark, when Jesus says, "I give you the keys to the church," to Peter, that when Peter was martyred, he was at that time he was the bishop of Rome, and the Catholic Church claims to have a letter giving that power from Christ. Peter giving it to a successor. Gosh, I used to remember the guy's name. Letter to Clement, Clement, and that Clement became his predecessor with the same powers that Jesus had given Peter. And that's, of course, the apostolic succession of the Pope. And the Protestants didn't buy into that. They challenged that. Okay, their soteriology, right? The study of salvation and how you get to heaven. They took out these 7 apocryphal books of the Catholic Bible because the second book of Maccabees made a strong hint of purgatory, and they didn't buy that because their soteriology was that it's not by works, right? That it's a free gift. You either accept it or you don't, and that Christ did all the work for you to go to heaven. And so the list goes on and on. They challenged the idea of the transubstantiation of the bread and the wine turning into the body and blood of Christ, and said it was just symbolic. And the list goes on. But then the Catholic authorities went to Trent. Okay, and dare I say one more thing about them challenging penance, right, and making it more into a work to make it to heaven. Is there was a guy named Johann Tetzel in Germany that was badly abusing the sacrament of penance. He was offering people opportunities to buy indulgences for themselves and for their loved ones who may be in purgatory, and making a lot of money off of it, playing on their fears. And so, at any rate, the Protestants expected that the Catholic Church, when they met at their next synod or council, that they would at least clean up some of their abuses. But when they met at Trent, the Council of Trent, the Catholic Church was very adamant about holding its ground. So they stuck with the apostolic succession of the Pope. They stuck with salvation by faith plus works. They stuck with their, because of course the Protestants said that there shouldn't be icons, statues and so forth that are kissed and prayed to, that they said that that was idolatry, only to God alone. And they stuck with their icons and saying that the icons led people to a more righteous life and inspired them. And so they held their ground, right? And they stuck with tradition. Okay. And that's all the more amazing that in the midst of doing that back in Europe, that they were so accommodating here in Mexico. So firstly, right, Philip II ordered, and by the way, the missionaries, especially the Franciscans, had already been doing it, that the missionaries learn the Nahua Aztec language and indulge in the sacraments for the Aztec newly converted, which we call in English neophytes, that the neophytes get to receive their sacraments and mass and everything in their own Nahua language. So that was a big accommodation. And then also, right, is there were some Spaniards, of course, like Sepulveda, who contended that if you don't have divine revelation, especially if you have a religion that involves human sacrifice, that you are being deceived by the devil. Okay, and there are verses in the Bible, especially the Apostle Paul, who writes that different, quote, pagan deities are really demons in disguise to lead people astray into a false god. So, of course, there were Catholics who believed that. But what the Franciscans and others did in Mexico is they said, no, we're not going to go that route. That's just going to turn them away. They said, what we're going to do is we're going to emphasize the similarities and give them a sense not only of continuity, that they're practically continuing their old religious ways, becoming Catholic, so that's less of a culture shock, but also, right, it'll show respect for them and their culture and the Spaniards' high esteem for the religion that they had already had. And yeah, so at any rate, they jumped on similarities, okay, and how they taught and instructed with catechism and so forth, the Aztec neophytes. So I gave a couple examples. Nanahuatzin could be likened to the Christian Christ. Texcalipoca could be likened to the devil. in Christianity, right? And then also, in addition to that, they showed the similarities, or they tried to appeal uh, to the the human sentiments, the human desires that these Aztec converts had. Okay, so for one, an obvious one is that there was a great gulf between the Pipitlin, the Aztec nobility, and the Magueses, the commoners. And so, at any rate, the commoners, right? Uh, they would have loved to live the noble lifestyle. Needless to say, all right. With the exception, of course, if you're noble and you get caught in war, you're the first one to get sacrificed. But other than that, life was good. And so, what they did is they likened confirmation, right? They likened confirmation to rising in social status in God's kingdom, so that they're becoming pipilin. They were becoming Christian nobles, right? And being anointed with the Holy Spirit in the sacrament of confirmation. So that it appealed to that desire of a lot of the poor Aztec converts. And then secondly, right, their culture, the Aztec culture, had been very much martial or military oriented. So they called them soldiers of Christ and said that now you become warriors and you're going to fight with the Archangel Michael against the powers of darkness and Satan, etc. And so all that was deliberate in trying to convert as many as they could, to get them to choose to become converted. All right. But nevertheless, right, the extent to which they learned the Aztec religion and culture and they accommodated them in how they taught, they weren't doing that elsewhere. Okay. Then, in addition to that, the likenesses in sacraments, right? It's amazing, some of the similarities. They had a somewhat kind of christening or baptism with water. I kid you not. The Aztec did for infants, for babies. So, of course, the idea of infant baptism with the Catholic Church, it was a smooth transition. They also believed in the concept of sin, in particular sexual sins, and they had a particular goddess whose priest they would go to, and they had, I kid you not, they had to show in the Nahuatl language, it says sorrow for your sins. And it's amazing because with the Catholic sacrament of penance, right, you need contrition, confession, and then absolution. All right. And contrition, you could arguably define it as the exact way the Aztec did, is that you feel sorrow over your sins. You have to mean it. You have to really be sorry. And so they were accustomed to this ritual. Okay. They believed in the equivalent of heaven, hell, and something like a purgatory, which is amazing. All right. And so the Spaniards took advantage of that and tried to make it seem like it was a nice continuation for them with just some, minor differences and shifts. So at any rate, they did all that. All right. Also, with confirmation, right, a couple other things that were kind of cool is the Spanish clerics, the clergy, they looked at the different Aztec rites of passage, right? Remember, with a rite of passage, you're transforming kind of organically from one phase of your growth, development in life to the next, right? So like the quinceañera, the Aztec had something like that. But they looked at the ages when they were decided to become self-aware and this and that. And I kid you not, in the Aztec codices, they began punishing and putting kids to work, considering that they were now responsible for their own conduct when they were 7. Well, it just so happened that in Catholic tradition, the age of reason, when a child kind of loses his or her innocence and being able to just go to heaven no matter what, the child now is responsible for his or her behavior and knows better. So they looked at the ages with 15 and 25. With 15 and 25, you left the house and you lived with the warriors. You learned and trained, and then by 25, you led men to battle. And so the Catholics looked at those different ages of rites of passage and they tried to make their sacraments like confirmation in line with those Aztec notions of when you become an adult and ready to go to war, etc. Right? Then, in addition to that, you have, let's see here, we already did that, the use of native oil called balsam. They began using balsam, and they began using white cloths that they would tie around the head of the young man or woman who was going through confirmation. That was Aztec. That was an Aztec tradition. Instead of using the European anointing oil and doing nothing with a towel around their head, that was Aztec. So see, there's just another way in which the Spaniards were trying to change and accommodate for the Aztec. And then, of course, you have the veneration of Mary, right? And regardless of what you think of that, right? Whether it really happened, etc. The idea is, right, is that a lot of Mexicans do believe it. And when allegedly Mary appeared to a young convert, it was to a native. It was to a poor native young man named Juan Diego. And it just so happens that she appeared right where the old statue of Tonantzin, the mother goddess of the Aztec. And she herself looked indigenous, they claim, when she showed herself. She was much darker skinned than the Europeans depict her in art, and had supposedly, quote, native features. Okay. I will have one thing to Juan Diego, the shawl. The shawl is an enigma. It's a puzzle. It is supposedly, right, 2 sets of proof that she gave to Juan Diego to give to Bishop Zumárraga, who thought he was crazy. One was a rose that only grew in Spain, and she gave it to him in Mexico. And the next one was a tilma, a cloak, and it had the image of Mary on it. And it's almost like a shroud of Turin of Christ. There's no scientific evidence like how it was put together. So at any rate, that's huge for Mexican Americans to this day. Because they said, you know what, out of all people, Mary appeared to an indigenous Mexican, looking like an indigenous Mexican herself, giving them hope, identity, etc., and some special attention. Right? So then beyond religion is literature. You had the Baroque movement in the 1600s back in Europe and Spain. And with the Baroque movement, like I said, you have sometimes following, then freely breaking Italian rules of meter. So, you know what I mean? Like you can go like with rhyme, A, B, or A, B, etc. They would begin showing that rhythmic pattern from Italy, and then they would break it whenever they wanted to. Okay. Employment of obscure vocabulary with unnecessarily wordy phrases. So to this day, right, Baroque kind of means kind of gaudy. And matter of fact, there was an artist who did a Baroque chapel, and his name was Gaudi. And that's where they get the term, Gaudy. And gaudy, right, is that it's unnecessarily, excessively fancy, right? Hiding the subject with metaphor. Employment of classical Greek and Roman figures, often heroes and their gods of Greece and Rome. And in particular, the subject of disillusionment, often in the form of satire. All right. So I'm saying here, not only did Native Mexicans emulate this style, but they made their contributions to it and adding their own touch to it. All right. So this privileges of the poor was interesting. Right? Notice the satire. The poor man is stupid if he keeps quiet, but if he speaks, he's a fool. He's a coward if he's humble, and if he obeys, he's seen as a flatterer. And the list just goes on with those types of examples in this poem. All right? So basically, the poor cannot win. That's a contribution that the Mexican writers gave to the Baroque movement. Yes, sometimes you had your tribute to the commoners, right, in Spanish literature. And of course, you have it with Don Quixote by Cervantes, right, in his famous first modern novel of European history. But the extent to which they're tackling the injustices, the inequities suffered by the poor, it was mainly Latin Americans over here who were forcing that to become part of dialogue with the Spanish. All right. Then you also had El Inca Garcilaso de la Vega. He had an Aztec noble mother and a conquistador father. And he was sent to Spain for his education. And he wrote most of his works in Spain over there. But when he writes, right, he's extremely proud of his Inca ancestry and almost offensive in trying to remind the Spaniards just how civilized and the culture creating capacity of the Native Americans, in particular the Inca. And what he did is he borrowed a notion from the scholastic movement during the Renaissance in Italy. And the scholastic movement contended, right, that man is born rational, but God is just simply super rational. So hence, anything that could be ascertained by reason could be ascertained by any ethnic group, any nationality, anywhere on the globe, because they're made in the image of God. They're all human beings, and they've all been given reason and logic powers at birth. But things like the Holy Trinity, the gospel, reason alone can't conjure that up. So then when something is super rational, God has to reveal it to us. But anything that doesn't have to be revealed, right? They said, you don't have to be a Catholic. You don't have to be a Christian. You've been born with reason by God, and you have culture creating capacity. You have intelligence in the arts and sciences, etc. And we could be impressed by, quote, pagan civilizations. So he brought that argument up, El Inca Garcilaso de la Vega. All right. And then also you have, what's the other guy's name? Gaspar Perez de Villagra. And this guy, right, says we have something unique here in New Mexico, is we have people who are carrying the DNA, not only of Hernan Cortez, arguably the most famous conqueror, but also of an Aztec princess. Okay. And so they said you have royalty from both lineages, European or Spanish and Native American. And then he says, and what do you know? They end up back in the homeland of the Aztec, the fabled land of Aztlan. Because remember, the Aztec and the Codex Mendoza, it stated that they came from the north and journeyed quite some distance down into Mexico. So some people believe that Aztlan could be, and of course later the Chicano movement in the 1960s contended this, that Aztlan had been somewhere in the present Western United States. All right. And then, of course, how can you forget about Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, right? She emulated the Spanish style and using lots of references to Greek and Roman gods, lots of metaphor, very kind of Baroque vocabulary and writing, okay? And she also showed a common theme of disillusionment, and that is youth and beauty. She supposedly was a very beautiful woman here in Mexico, and she said she got all this attention from the men, but she says now she's getting older and she's going to die. She said it was all polvo, caduco, nada. She says it was all dust. It was all steam. It just blew away. It was ephemeral. It was here today and gone tomorrow. It meant nothing. It's empty. And so that was a typical Baroque type of poem. All right. But she has a famous letter to the Catholic authorities back in Spain, and she defends the right of women to become educated and to speak their mind in politics, way ahead of her time. All right. Now, don't get me wrong. the Spaniards were a little bit uh, ahead of the scale with the English when it came to property rights of women, but political participation, no. All right. So she added that to the mix, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. And then, of course, folklore. So you have, first of all, that I put here are dichos, right? Sayings. So, yeah, I give you about 4 or 5 examples of those sayings. Okay. And of course, they deal with every facet of life. One that cracked me up, I read, was that there goes the donkey back to the corn. I'm like, what is that supposed to mean? And supposedly it's when someone who keeps doing something idiotic goes back to his stupid actions, his stupidity. That was the saying they had, is there goes the donkey back to the cornfield. So at any rate, they had a lot of them. And of course, some of them seem almost universal that we have almost an equivalent to, like the very first one I have. Remember, not all that shines is gold. Okay. Then in addition to that, of course, you have the famous cases of I didn't put the duendes. I love the duendes. But you have La Llorona. And you guys are probably familiar with that one, right? Initially, they connected it to La Malinche, the woman who was a Native American translator for Cortez and lover. And she'd been sold by her own family when she was young out of desperation. And she had reasons not to feel a sense of much loyalty to her own tribe. And so, at any rate, when she is taken by them, because she knows Nahua, she quickly learned Spanish, and she knew the language of the Tlaxcalans, their allies. Um, the the story usually is connected to her, and it's not always anymore. But they contend, right, that she had a few kids with Cortez. Cortez promised her the world, that he was going to marry her, make an honest woman out of her, etc. And then he's given pressure to marry more of a legitimate equal to his, now as an Hidalgo noble. So he marries a more noble ranking woman instead. And in a fit of rage, La Malinche drowns her own kids and then drowns herself. And then the kids, right, are told, be careful, especially anywhere around water. La Llorona is walking around the ghost looking for her children, and she's willing to grab other children in replacement of them if need be. And then the duendes, they crack me up. The duendes, right, you're probably familiar with. They contend that the origin is when they had Lucifer's rebellion in heaven. 1/3 of the angels chose to stay loyal to God under Michael. 1/3 of them chose to rebel, and the third that could not make up their minds were turned into trolls and sent to wander the earth. And so, at any rate, they're called duendes, and they're supposed to be up to mischief and no good, trying to convince little boys to do honorary things, or sometimes even hurting the little boys. All right. And then what also continued on with Native American culture was brujeria, right? Technically witchcraft, all right? So you have the curanderos and the curanderas who were like faith healers. And so, one of the famous ones that I hear are still pretty prevalent is the mal de ojo, the evil eye. And so if you in Mexican culture, oftentimes Iberian culture for that matter, the Portuguese are still like this as well. You see someone with a beautiful child and you comment, oh, what a beautiful child. You're supposed to say after that, God keep him or God keep her. Because if you don't, they're afraid that you looked at the child with envy, that the other person has such a beautiful, healthy child, and you want something bad to happen to that baby. And so hence they'll go to these people and they'll have these ideas of things you could wear around your wrist and other types of things to protect you and your children from the evil eye. All right. And then, of course, El Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead. That largely was the ritual of Tlaxco-Chimaco of the Aztec, whereby they would provide food and personal items for the dead. Because to them, right, there was always a cosmic force that was moving up and down the famous five divine trees of the creations. So there's one in the middle, and there's one at the four cardinal points of the world on the four corners. And divine energy flows through those five, connecting the underworld to earth to the heavens. And of course, it has to be fed by human sacrifice, by the shedding of blood. And so, at any rate, they believe that with that being the case, you could easily go to the Lord of the Dead and his consort or his lover, and these are their two names right there. I won't even try. And they could be bribed. You could challenge them to battles of wit and other types of battles. And if you defeat them, you get to at least temporarily leave the underworld. All right. So the Catholic Church took this and they took their idea of All Saints Day as well as All Souls Day, and they meshed with the Aztec in creating the Day of the Dead. All right. So All Saints Day, it's not actually, from what I've read, it's not actually saints per se. Those who have been canonized by the Catholic Church as adults. It's children, right? They believe, especially under 7, before the age of accountability, if a child should die, the child has no need to go to purgatory, nothing, just go straight to heaven. So November 1st is supposed to be for children who have died, and November 2nd is primarily for loved ones who are in purgatory and allowed to come and visit their families. So at any rate, and there's a sense of the inevitability of death amongst the Aztec and the Spanish. Infant mortality was high. Lifespans were not very long. And so they were surrounded by that truth, that death was always around the corner. All right. And then lastly, I think lastly, is I have colonial rules of etiquette. So supposedly, right, in the colonial time, if you were interested in a young woman, you'd put a pumpkin or a gourd on her porch, and she'd either smash it or not. And if she smashed it, oh gosh, it's been a long time. I think if she smashed it, that was a bad thing, but I could be wrong. But at any rate, she responded that pumpkin. And then if you pass that test, you were allowed to have chaperone dates. And of course, it was chaperoned by a male in her family, oftentimes a brother or a dad. And then you date for a while. And then when you're ready to request a marriage, you bring the men of your house, oftentimes your brothers and your father or an uncle, and you would go to the bride-to-be's house and you would ask for her hand in marriage if the parents are okay with it. Sometimes the parents would say, we're not sure, we want a trial period. And so I forget how long the trial period was, but for a certain period of time, you would go and live with your prospective in-laws, and you could request that she come and do the same and live with her prospective in-laws. And then after that, if it was decided by the parents to be okay, you put an address in the newspaper or the periodical in the church. You paid for the wedding, the male. You also paid for her wedding dress and gave the money to her parents. You were to go to the sacrament of penance or reconciliation, as well as communion, just before the wedding. I thought it was interesting that I've heard of people that still continue this tradition. When they take their knees during mass at the wedding, they put a lariat, a cowboy rope, around the husband and wife, and of course, it's symbolic that they're together now, for good and for bad. And then, of course, they have the reception and so forth, right? So then you have indigenous music. There was a zapateado style, almost like tap dancing back in Spain. And it met with the percussions and the flute and other instruments of Native Americans. And it formed things like El Baile de los Viejitos, the dance of the elderly. And that's really cool. They put on masks that make them look elderly. They have canes. They begin looking as if they could hardly stand up, much less move. And they slowly begin dancing until they show just how young and agile they are in this type of tap dance. And And then oftentimes you could do it as a joke with a loved one who is getting up in age. You could have have that dance brought to their birthday party. And then you have the Harabe Gatuno. And I I don't know about the rhythmic if there was syncopation, like in the Caribbean. Syncopation is like in rap, right? When not everything is not all the melody is along the same consistent path, that you have like one and then you have a counter to it. Anyway, I think there was syncopation to this, and it took Latin America by storm. And so much so that the Spanish Inquisition tried to shut it down because they said that it encouraged those who danced it to be sexually immoral. So at any rate, then at the end, though the Spanish-American relationship began with violence and power dynamics that were retained for centuries, cultural borrowing and mixing inevitably occurred, especially after the age of military conquest. This mestizaje forms the heritage of today's Mexican Americans. All right. So that's it. That's hopefully it's pretty simple thesis, right? So that despite the fact that politically, especially, and economically, I would say, it was kind of a one-way street. The Spanish colonizers called the shots, right? And took the best seats in the house. Socially, culturally, they blended with the Native Americans. They're willing to compromise. They're willing to adapt Native American principles, practices, etc. And so hence Mexican Americans can be proud of both parts of their heritage. Because it's obvious that, a lot of Mexican Americans they could speak Spanish, which is the Castilian Spanish. And they also, many of them are Roman Catholic. So that clearly shows the Spanish influence of their heritage. But I'm making the argument that the natives were a big part of their heritage as well, and as a quote mestizo people. All right. Anybody have any comments or questions? Are you guys still there? Are you following me? You guys, you haven't died of boredom, have you? Anybody give me a thumbs up, please? Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Diego. Just want to make sure. I have no problem with you guys not wanting to show your faces. I'm always bashful when I'm the student too. Um, but yeah, I needed something to make sure that you guys could hear me this whole time. You guys are still there. All right, good, good. Okay, guys, so you guys hang in there, okay? And you guys are the so yeah, what I'm doing is I just wrote this up. And if you look at the footnotes, I did a lot of studying for it. And I'm doing one more as well on the English that I'm adding this semester. So that is the reason why I haven't graded anything yet, is I'm literally writing two new assignments, and yeah. So when I do, which hopefully is soon, you guys are the first class I'll do. Okay, and I have 6 classes. So hang in there with that. Okay, I'm sorry that I haven't graded anything yet. But if you guys are okay, I'm gonna go ahead and let you go. You guys have a good week. Okay, thank you. You'll get your extra credit points for this assignment. I appreciate you attending. All right. All right. You guys have a good day. Okay. Thank you, Xavier.